the strength of this is precisely in highlighting those tacit understandings, which might be private, versus kind of explicit political commitments, and various steps along the way between national identification, which you never once think about, but you probably have an answer to it if you were, gun to your head, excuse the image, but like gun to your head, you would be able to say, okay, fine, Croat, but that's pretty deep down there, and you never reflect upon it until the public authority asks you to answer this
of articulation
thing.
Comes from
Yeah.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, dearest inner circle of patrons to BungaCast. This is the Reading Club. We're back with the third episode in this theme on inter/nationalism in the 21st century. Very much a 21st century style of punctuation. I feel like late 20th century would be parentheses, very postmodern, right? The slash, I think, is angular, very end of history, I feel like. Anyway, internationalism in the 21st century, what happens to nationalism after globalization? That's the big question we're discussing over the course of 4 episodes. This is the third of 4. To remind you, the first 2 episodes were, well, it was a bit of a double dose from Eric Hobsbawm. The first one, his book on nationalism from 1870 to, or from 1780 to some later time in the 20th century. I can't remember the date. Anyway, but this is all there. It'll be linked to in the show notes. You can click on the syllabus and read all this yourself. And you can understand reading stuff much more than listening, which is not a great thing for a podcast host to say. Anyway, so, and then last time round, we did The Invention of Tradition, also by Eric Hobsbawm, which was a lot of fun. I thought that was very illuminating. And we're back for the third iteration of this. And I will pass over to Phil, who will be leading this and whose choice of reading this all has been.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. This is slightly break with past Reading Club material because it's a PhD thesis, so it's technically an exam. It's not a monograph or a book intended for popular consumption or expert consumption for that matter. PhD dissertation intended to pass an examination. So with that caveat in mind, it's by a Dutch academic who was based in the UK. The PhD itself was published through the University of Hull. And it's about his ethnographic anthropological fieldwork that he conducted in the aftermath of the wars of Yugoslav secession in the 1990s. And it's the fruits of that scholarly research, that scholarly endeavor. So I wanted to, partly the reason that I want to just briefly kind of explain why we're doing a PhD thesis rather than something which is kind of published for a wider audience. And there are several reasons for it. So one reason is this was specifically recommended to me by a colleague of mine from the region who talked about it, and it was out of conversations about the idea of anti-nationalism and how it featured across the region. That was interesting to me and intriguing to me, and specifically because it's also the one point on the matrix, I guess, of the various versions or variants of the concepts that we're exploring. So there's nationalism, internationalism, and then also anti-nationalism, at least the way in which it's developed in this. And I thought it made a useful counterpoint. Obviously, there is a risk with engaging with a PhD thesis, and that will be evident, I'm sure, anyone who's managed to do the reading for this one. So with that in mind, but luckily we've got some highly educated fellow travellers in the room to help explain it. One of them has a PhD from Oxford. The other is very well versed in LSE theory. And so hopefully we're in a good position to go. Hopefully we're in a good position to go through the material. It is, it kind of has the thesis itself has very much of the feel of continental political philosophy / cultural theory dissertation from the time, which is to say the mid to late 1990s, early 2000s, with all the ticks. And by which I say ticks, I don't mean as opposed to crosses. I mean the kind of repetitive, involuntary genuflection to scholarly authorities of various kinds, as Ricoeur says, as Foucault says, as Balibar says, this kind of stuff, which is, I think it's frustrating and annoying.
Is that of its time, or is that just of scholarly work?
I think,
well,
scholars do that. People who
it's
enjoy
of scholarly
scholarly
work.
pursuits,
It's certainly of scholarly work, but it's of the people who are referred to, I think, and the particular way in which they're referred to, I think, very much speaks to its time. So despite that, what I think was impressive about this as a piece of work, as a piece of scholarly work, was the empirical material. Very, how shall I say, conscientiously presented, very thorough as far as anthropological work goes, very self-conscious and reflexive, all of the kind of standards by which ethnography is measured, as well as historically and discursively contextualized. So all of that is to the credit of Stefaan Jansen, who's the academic behind it. The other element that I wanted to explain, part of the background for selecting it, was my own kind of family connections to the region, which helped me understand something which has only really become visible in retrospect. So we've discussed or touched upon briefly at other points on the podcast, we've talked plenty about Brexit. But one of the discussions about Brexit that became more widely known was this idea of somewheres and anywheres, an idea developed by David Goodhart, who's a conservative, I'd say centrist / conservative, public intellectual, think tanker, associated with various kind of policy debates over the last 20 to 30 years. But he developed in the context of the Brexit debate, conflict, he developed this idea of somewheres and anywheres as the central political cleavage, and one that had larger international reverberations. And it's something which really crystallized in public debate in the context of Brexit, the divide between those who associated themselves kind of globally with the kind of urban metropoles, which could have been in any kind of major global European or North American city, and whose orientation was generally outwards towards networks that were transnational. Their political loyalties lay with global ideas, particularly the European Union, obviously in the context of Brexit. And then those people who were more rooted. They stayed closer to family. They didn't go to a campus university that took them far away. They chose jobs which allowed them to stay within living distance of their family, and they might come from smaller provincial towns and cities, outlying regions. And he characterized this as a central cleavage, and it was certainly borne out by Brexit. The reason I'm saying all that is not because I particularly want to talk about Brexit, but because this was the somewhere anywhere's distinction, even though it was only raised by David Goodhart in the context of Britain. It suddenly crystallized for me an understanding of politics throughout the Balkans that was staring me in the face for a very long time, but I hadn't actually grasped it, which is to say that you had a division which ran right through my family, in fact, between people. Very much that cleavage was exactly there. People who, either by virtue of their professional standing or their work, oriented outwards, understood the political future in terms of greater European integration, or those who were more communitarian, perhaps in their instincts, who felt that national revival was, or survival even, was more inwardly, required more inward focus, and that there was a genuine clash, not only a political cleavage in terms of voting behavior, but also a wider sociological, cultural clash between these two groups. And in the context of the Balkans, it was felt one way to divide it would be between people who worked for NGOs or NGO adjacent professions, various kinds of middle classes, professional middle classes, trying to maintain their standard of living and their social position in the wake of all the turmoil and conflict in the region, as well as the economic problems that continue to bedevil the region. And those who had to make do either by falling back on traditional sources of employment or the grey economy, or managed to survive in some other ways, but were not connected to essentially international sources of funding. The idea of anti-nationalism was fascinating to me in this context, and in particular the way in which it intersected at various levels. And this is something that Jansen touches in the course of his discussion. It's anti-nationalism as against the insular and closed ethno-nationalisms that emerge in the wake of the disintegration of Yugoslavia. But it also takes place in the context of a larger civic national identity, which was Yugoslavia itself. This idea of this pan-Slavic federation led by the Communist Party under Tito since the end of the Second World War. And so anti-nationalism exists in that context, at once kind of claiming a larger national identity of a non-existent kind of a ghostly state formation that claims the territory of all of these successor states, at the same time as being opposed to the smaller national identity associated with the successor states. So it was that dynamic that seemed to me fascinating, but also the potential to globalize, conceptually at least, that dynamic between somewheres and anywheres, and to think about it more broadly. So I'm not so concerned about the Ricoeur and references and Foucault references and Balibar and what have you, though listeners might wish to bring them up, or indeed my fellow podcast hosts might, but I'm more interested in how the empirical material, the empirical insights are drawn out through that. Some of the concepts are interesting. So I wanted to begin.
I should say just at this point, actually, regarding your questions, listeners, is that we're, as we announced last couple of times, but just reminding you that the fourth episode in this section on nations and nationalism, on inter/nationalism, will be dealt with in a live episode. So we're going to collate the questions that you've had over the course of the past 3 episodes. In our 4th episode, which we'll do live and also kind of engage, and have a kind of conversation on the go as well when we come to do the final section of this, which will be in a month, and we'll announce the date. I think I can tell you the date now, but it'll also be written down if you prefer. So that's going to be on Saturday, the 14th June at what is that? Midday Eastern time in the US, which is 9 a.m. Pacific time, and in Europe that works out to 5 p.m. I think in the UK, and 6 p.m. in Central European time.
You could have just said 5 p.m. GMT or BST.
But it is. I mean, it is. It's BST. Britain's one ahead of GMT right now, isn't it? So,
yeah, British summertime. That's an important one. Yeah, we're going to be live and unplugged. Well, not unplugged. We're going to be plugged in. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to record. But please join us, listeners. It's going to be fun.
So, by way of opening up, I suppose it's worth first, as with any kind of anthropological ethnographic work, thinking about his Jansen's own how he explains his own motivation, his choice to focus on anti-nationalism in this context, post-conflict context, and how his background as this kind of activist academic hybrid shapes the study's perspective. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I had some misgivings about some aspects of this overall work. I don't want to be too negative at too many points, but I do feel it's quite laboured. This is maybe a feature of many PhD theses. Instead of basically saying, here's my background and here's how it might have informed, there's like 3 pages of sometimes, anthropologists need to use autobiography and sometimes they don't, and here's what this person says, and here's what that person says, and it basically boils down to the fact that he's like Belgian/Dutch and his mum was born literally on the border, and so he understands the difference between 2 countries which are kind of similar and kind of close to each other. That's and
it's like perfectly fine, and he comes down and his approach is like, well, so I'm going to be commonsensical about this, and you're like, yep, good. And it's like, yeah, I agree with you. It's like, it's kind of labored in going through it, but it comes down. Ultimately, I find him sympathetic in that regard, and that in him going like, let's not do too much of the reflexivity bullshit. That's too much. But I'm also, you have to be aware of the fact that your own biases might be brought to the table. So we'll just have be common sense about this, which is like, yeah, cool. I agree with you, but
it's being reflexive about reflexivity instead of him just saying like, here's what my background is. He's saying like, here's the importance of backgrounds. No, but I think, in some ways I didn't.
It's a good point, George.
I didn't really need to kind of hear the justification. I think it's a really important lens. Like, had me at the title of Anti-Nationalism, Post-Yugoslav Resistance and Narratives of Self and Society, because I think that's, that's it's an interesting historical context, and it's an important kind of framing of how people understood, themselves and their relationship to their nation at this point in time.
So you make a good point, George, about the kind of the layers of reflexivity. I think part of the reason though he's motivated to explain his own background is because he's constantly asked about it in the region himself. He says like it's important to other people as a way of understanding where he's coming from in a way that wouldn't occur to him, off his own kind of initiative. It doesn't seem to be to him important, but it seems more important in the context of being a foreigner somewhere else. Where do you come from? What shapes you? And that I think is a good, it's a useful reminder that it's precisely kind of when we're transposed to a different context that those things actually they become more significant and meaningful when you're in a different place with different people and different, national backgrounds and individual stories.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.